You have entered Roguelike Radio.
Hello and welcome to Roguelike Radio, the procedurally generated podcast where all of the participants eventually die. This episode we are talking about procedural generation in game design, a new book edited by Tanya X and Tarn Adams, looking at the applications of procedural generation to game design. Talking today we have...
I'm Tarn Adams. I'm the co-creator of Dwarf Fortress with my brother, and I edited this book.
Yeah, I'm Tanya X, the captain of Kitfox Games and co-editor of Procedural Generation in Game Design.
I'm Mark Johnson. I'm a games academic, and I make Ultima Ratio Regum.
You also had some input into this book, Mark?
And I also had some input into this book, as Darren reminds me. Yes, I wrote 3 chapters for this book on worlds, AI, and meaning.
And I'm Darren Grey, and I wrote one of the chapters on when and why to use procedural generation. So welcome to the show, Tarn and Tanya. We've had you both on here before, but it's great to have you both on again. This book has been in the making for some time now, so it's very exciting to see it released. So it should be noted this is intended to be a very comprehensive book on applying procedural generation to game design. How was it that this book came about?
Well, last year, Tarn and I gave a talk at GDC, basically showing our tools and processes for how we were putting procedural mythologies into our respective games, Moon Hunters and Dwarf Fortress. And when GDC started publicizing the fact that we were giving this talk together, CRC Press had the idea of having us make a book together, because obviously we worked well and we collaborated at least as far as making a talk. Now, this was before they had actually seen the talk, but they didn't rescind the offer after we gave the talk, so I guess it was good enough.
Yeah, I mean, we ended up meeting the I guess what is his job title? The editor, or the person in charge of everything or something at a booth at GDC?
Yeah, I think person in charge of everything was about right. Yeah.
Yeah, they have a nice little booth that they take to GDC probably every year with hundreds of books, and we just met up over there and talked a little bit about what the book might be and whether we'd be able to find enough contributors for it, that kind of thing. And then they had us send in an official proposal after we were able to find some people.
Yeah, I mean, I think their original idea was that Tarn and I would write a book together, but neither of us really felt kind of up to that. We're not book writers, really. So instead, we were like, well, what if we instead had a bunch of authors that contributed articles, and we kind of curated that, and they accepted that proposal. So there you go.
Cool. And was there some indication from them that there was a demand for this?
That was us. I think Tanya was the one that proved there was a demand for it with Google search rankings and all that kind of thing. It was part of our proposal.
I don't know how they originally determined the demand, because, I mean, they came to us with the idea of the book. I mean, I think it's been pretty obvious, like the last few years, it's gotten more competitive, but a few years ago when I pitched, Tarn and me and Tyler from Darkest Dungeon and a few other people on a procedural generation panel at PAX or whatever, it was always like completely full. But I mean, I'm pretty sure they weren't at those PAX talks. So I don't know. I mean, if you look online, procedural generation is a pretty hot topic. So I'm glad they saw that. But when I was trying to look up like what the competing books would be, I didn't really find anything that I would want to order. I mean, there were a couple that were really cool sounding in terms of academic theory or in terms of programming, but there really wasn't anything about game design specifically, and especially that had any like concrete commercial usage. So I think it is actually a unique book.
And do you know much about CRC Press and their other publications?
Do you own any of their textbooks, Tarn?
I have the CRC. The CRC, that's what people call it. It's the this giant 1,500 page or something chemistry book that just has a list of all the little molecules and their properties. That was the kind of big book that they did. I also have a few of their game books, but no, they're a really important kind of academic publisher.
Okay, so CRC are fairly well known for academic publishing and for publishing other game design books. So this book, 336 pages, got 27 chapters, as well as obviously a preface from Tanya and Tarn. How did you go about deciding on the scope of this and what topics you wanted covered?
Well, actually, isn't the preface by Derek Yu, Tarn?
Yep, that's right. That's right. Yeah, no, it was exciting. And he
didn't write that on the cover, to be honest.
Well, we kind of floated that idea, but I don't know if there's some rule that prefaces need to be secret. I don't think so, because I've seen like preface by on the cover or something, but yeah. Maybe CRC has their own way of handling things. Yeah, there's a secret Derek Yu preface, and of course he's the person that was made Spelunky, and also was one of the makers of Aquaria. And does he also make more stuff now? It's been a while.
He also made the sprites for Doom the Roguelike. Very important contribution.
Cool. But to answer your question, we knew that we wanted to invite the people we admired who had made really cool stuff to write things for the book. And so we kind of asked all the people we knew who we thought were nice people who also were super smart and made cool stuff. And then, I think the original goal was only to have 15 authors, but somehow there just kept being more and more awesome people with awesome ideas for chapters. You might also notice the second half of it is all about procedural narrative, which is kind of a whole completely different topic. Maybe that should have been its own book. It's hard to say. We just basically followed the passion of the authors. Like we came up with a bunch of topics that we thought would be interesting for them to write about. And then we kind of said, well, we think you'd be great at this topic. Is there anything you did with this you'd like to talk about? Maybe Mark, you had a different experience as an author, especially if I think you're the only person who wrote 3 chapters.
I believe I was, yes. I thought it was great. I really liked the fact that as far as I can recall, I pitched quite a few things. The 3 that got in, and I think I pitched a couple of extras as well. I really liked kind of being able to basically just pitch what it was I fancied speaking about. I probably took on a little bit too much in hindsight, but that is the nature of being an academic in a nutshell. But I think it worked out okay in the end. And when I saw the kind of final the final kind of list of all the chapters, it seemed like it worked out extremely well in terms of A, how they could be grouped, and B, kind of the links that could be drawn between all the chapters seem really strong. And if there had been fewer chapters, it kind of feels as if there might have been fewer links there in the end, perhaps.
It's probably worth noting, just in terms of the structure of the book, there's 4 sections overall, I believe. 4, yes. The first section, the first 5 chapters are on procedural generation. And it's kind of more on the design side at a high level about use of procedural generation. Section 2 is on procedural content, so getting more low level onto things like level design and cyclic generation of puzzles and logic. And that's actually probably the main bit of the book, actually. It goes on, it has probably the most set of chapters there on very practical chapters about how to use procedural content generations for specific content generation. Then section 3 is on procedural narrative, and it has some stuff from story and plot generation, emergent narrative, poetry, characters. And then section 4 is on procedural future, and a number of very interesting chapters there on more cutting edge areas, like automated game tuning was quite an interesting one. And Mark did a fantastic chapter on meaning in procedural generation, which is a wonderfully evocative chapter with lots of interesting ideas.
Oh, thank you, Darren.
Was that 4-section structure in there from the start? Or did that come out of the sort of chapters that you were getting together?
It was pretty much there from the start. I remember we went through just kind of tossing around ideas and searching online and stuff just to kind of refamiliarize ourselves with the breadth of what people had actually done. And it sort of fell into that structure that you're either making kind of stuff you can put your hands on, or you're trying to do story generation or making narratives, that kind of thing, or you're doing something that's kind of hard to categorize, but it's still kind of hands-on, like this chapter on Flappy Bird variant generation, right? And but then there's just the overview. I think it was pretty much the structure from the start. We had a few extra ideas there that we didn't get authors for, and we got sort of a lot of authors in other areas that maybe we ended up adding a chapter. We were quite fortunate. We had an original target of 200 pages, but the publisher was kind of enthusiastic about going over, so we were able to accommodate everybody.
That makes the editing job easier.
Well, it also makes it twice as long.
It should be noted there's, I don't know how many authors there are exactly, I'm guessing around 20 or so. And for Roguelike Radio listeners, there's a number of very recognizable names in there. Jim Shepard from the maker of Dungeon Mans has a chapter on handcrafted integration in level design. Michael Cook, who has been on a few times about game design in academia, has a chapter on ethical procedural generation. Jason Grinblatt and Brian Bucklew, the developers of Caves of Cud, they have several chapters in there as well, with a lot of interesting things from their experiences. And a few other well-known names from the procedural generation community have chapters in there. So lots of really relevant stuff for the roguelike community.
Yeah, I was really, I guess pleasantly surprised that so many people responded positively. I think there might be an interesting overlap between someone who's interested in procedural generation and someone who's interested in, writing chapters for textbooks or something. But I was really surprised that Kate Compton and Wyatt Chang from Blizzard and Ben Kane from Keep Talking Nobody Explodes and Danny Day from Desktop Dungeons, they all found time to write these really insightful articles and hopefully teach more people, how to move forward with procedural generation.
So what was your role as editors then in terms of managing the content that you were receiving from the different authors?
Well, in retrospect, we probably should have written a chapter each ourselves, because it's a bit strange now when we tell people about the book, that we didn't actually write any of it. Do you still feel weird about that, Tarn?
Yeah. It's. I mean, we certainly could have contributed something interesting to the book. I think. I mean, part of the issue was we were already sort of in this ongoing dialogue about page length, and we're like, we'll also throw in 40 pages of our own or something. We wanted to keep every contributor we got. So, but yeah, it's definitely weird in retrospect to just say, we wrote 4 pages of the book.
That's true. It's true, technically.
The section introductions were collaborative efforts by us. We sent those back and forth quite a few times, but I'm quite happy with how it turned out.
Yeah, I mean, so the process was that we sent out asking, okay, everybody, who wants to write a chapter for this? If you're on my list of cool people that make cool stuff, then let me know if you have time for this in the next few months. And then basically the people who got back to me, I made them sign it in blood a little bit. And then I left them alone for a couple months. And a few months later, I started knocking on their email doors, asking for their rough drafts, some of which were perfect and didn't really require much massaging. But others, unfortunately, I think I might have done a little bit of a hatchet job on Mark's chapters. I'm interested to see what he thinks of the final versions. But there was a lot in there, a lot of good stuff that Mark writes in a very unique style. So
that's very diplomatically put, Tanya. Thank you.
Well, they're great chapters. I just worry that have you read them yet? The final ones?
Did you send them back to me a few months ago, those ones?
Did I? I guess that maybe I had waking nightmares that I never sent them back to you for approval or anything. I feel like I wanted to. Did I?
I need to check this. I think so.
There were just a few rewordings, and we got in a kind of edit war over some phrasing, and I think we came out of that all right looking at the book.
Yeah, they didn't like the phrase game mechanic.
They hate it.
What?
It's a mechanic as somebody who fixes things.
Oh,
You think a book publisher would understand that some words have multiple meanings?
I genuinely physically just face-palmed. I'm sorry. That's just not acceptable.
Yeah, no, they went ahead and rewrote every use of the word game mechanic and tried to pluralize it, which was really confusing. And so I just did a Control F on everybody's chapter to catch them. And looking at the final copy, they didn't tell us if they fixed it or not, but looking at the final copy, it turns out our preferred phrasing was used everywhere. So
good.
That's good.
I think we survived. Yeah, but I mean, mostly, I mean, that was the one problem. That process was actually really nice.
Yes, so to answer the question, which was asked a while back, I've not seen the final versions, and now I'm deeply scared about what they look like. But with that said, I didn't feel like anything was being lost in terms of what I'd written, and this kind of segues into something I wanted to ask, which is, when I submitted, I recognized that I think I was the only academic who wrote something who wasn't an academic in CS or a related field, and so I did kind of strongly suspect that what I wrote might have wound up a little bit different. But I wanted to ask: was there maths and was there code in other chapters or not?
A little bit. In a few of the chapters, there was either pseudocode or kind of a description of code, or maybe as an appendix, like a few lines of code. I think Jim Shepard's chapter actually had the most.
Yeah, Wyatt Chang was really heavy on pseudocode too. The one about StarCraft and Diablo pseudocode for wave generation. And then, of course, there's Brian Bucklew's chapter on algorithms and approaches, which actually has less pseudocode, but it's just like basically a roadmap to anything you might think of for intro procedural generation. Like, you have to know about subdivisions and cellular automata and normal distributions and weighing tiles and just every little thing. I guess we missed the dawning era of waveform collapse as the new procedural generation. But
yeah, I mean, most chapters, it was more about the design process and less about the code. So, I mean, and some of them were much more even higher level than that. So I don't think your chapters were strange in terms of content at all.
Well, that's good to know.
Did you notice much difference in how you've got multiple academics here contributing, but also multiple completely independent people? Were there big variations in style? And
yes.
Did you have to manage that, or?
I mean, we didn't want to change anyone's voice too seriously. So, I mean, yes, I am self-conscious about changes I made to Mark's chapter. I think that the most obviously on the other side of the spectrum might have been Keppa's chapters, because they were very blunt to the point, factual. And so I might have wanted a little bit more theoretical explanation and I might have fluffed that a little bit. But generally, I think it's actually kind of nice to feel like you're talking to different designers and you're getting different perspectives and different tastes and voices. And we didn't want it to be a cold manual where it was all bland, because it wouldn't really be reflecting, the creators behind it.
Yeah, I think it's actually one of the fantastic and unique things about a collection of works like this, because you can really see all sorts of different springboards for people hidden in there, right? And I think it's going to allow people to find a flavor of procedural generation they like and then really dig into it. I mean, if someone finds, say, Emily Short's chapter on sort of interactive fiction personalities and that kind of thing to just be the most fascinating one, and then they Google Emily Short, then they're in for a treat, right? So I think we're gonna have a lot of interesting things hopefully come out of this book.
Good. And so if either of you had written a chapter in this, what would it have been?
Wow, that's a good question. Tarn, did you have an idea of what you were going to write about? Because I definitely didn't. I can come up with something real quick. But
yeah, well, I mean, I could have probably stolen Mark's Worlds chapter or something, given that we both have a lot of experience in that kind of thing. But they're probably, I mean, more uniquely maybe just something about personalities and emergent narrative. That's kind of more like Jason Grunblatt's chapter, I guess, his second one about Caves of Cud. I mean, we really did get pretty comprehensive. So maybe that's another issue, is that at the end of the day, we had this list of authors covering these topics, and we'd have to step on some toes. I mean, if Tanya did a Moon Hunters map generation, which is quite interesting, that we had 3 of those, right?
Yeah.
So it's difficult actually to come up with a unique topic. I think. Oh,
I know what we should have done. What we should have done is just adapted our GDC talks from this year, our little mini talks about mythologies and that kind of thing, because that could fit in there for sure.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the talk about how we can eventually get an allegory generated in a game, right? Mm-hmm. Would have I mean, I guess that's more like Mark's meaning chapter, perhaps, or a complement to that. Getting sort of cultural artifacts that are layered into a game completely procedurally. But I mean, my kind of issue there is that my GDC talk was all sort of, it's half in the game and half not. And I'd prefer to have something concrete before I just start yammering on about what's possible.
Well, but you did your interesting magic system. I feel like that would have been a good, at least whatever is in the game at this point about that might have been good.
Yeah, that's another case where it's half done. I mean, the most fascinating part about magic system generation is going to be the part that, I don't know what's going to happen. And just trying to sort of calm that a little bit and make it fit into the game without utterly breaking it is going to lead to a lot of new situations and problems to solve that I haven't thought very carefully about yet. So I think there's going to be a whole new sort of section about that. It's more like Michael Cook actually had 2 chapters in the book, and not just the ethical procedural generation, but also a shorter one on generating rules for games. We were kind of, he was kind of, we wanted him to write a long chapter about that, because that's actually one of his main focuses, right? Is sort of game generation. And that's another thing that I'm really interested in as well, but I also haven't done yet. I wanted to do the bar game generation in Dwarf Fortress for people just playing in taverns with little randomly generated games. But again, it's more of an interest and not something that I have concrete screenshots of or anything. So,
were there any chapters that particularly surprised you with the content that you got? Things you hadn't thought about, perhaps, or new ways of looking at things?
So I was. The short answer is yes, of course. But I remember being struck by Michael Cook's ethical procedural generation chapter. Not most of the things I had thought about, but I thought his the part about Rogue Dream was really interesting. I don't know if he's been on to talk about that before, which was the game where you use Google milking to generate a game. So you type in one noun, say a cat, and then you use Google milking, which is typing in half of a phrase and then using the autocomplete that Google does to see what the world thinks about it. So you type in why do cats hate? And then it would give you, say, water, right, as the autocomplete. And then you make water the enemy in your game and use Google image search to get pictures of water. And so it can generate an entire game from one noun by feeding in different verbs into Google related to that noun. And of course, and they wanted to use this in an educational setting, but you can imagine some of the nouns you type in give you just the horrible id of the world, right? The worst Google searches you can think of related to different minorities and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it was just a really interesting chapter, because I hadn't even thought about using that sort of autocomplete to generate a game before. That was fascinating.
Yeah, that was a 7-day roguelike that he made a few years ago. I know the example he tends to use and where that goes wrong is if you type in priest as your noun, then the game goes to Google and asks, why do priest? And then comes up with a verb from the Google autocomplete and uses that as an action in the game. And the thing that autocompletes is rape boys. And that's not what you're expecting when you're making a game like that. And suddenly you're drawing in sorts of content that you really weren't intending.
Yeah. I was really struck by the chapters by Danny Day and Ben Kane, because they're both very, I don't know, they're at least Ben Kane was his procedural logic chapter was interesting to me, because I had no idea the way that they were using procedural generation in Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. And so the example that he's writing his chapter on is the manual for the game is generated based on the rules they have programmed for the game. And I had no idea. I played the game. I liked it. And it was really more of an expedience thing for them. Theoretically, they could write the manual by hand every time they changed the game rules. But in practice, they found that that was introducing way too many errors and inconsistencies. And so having the manual actually match what the game was trying to generate for its own puzzles, I think his breakdown of how they did that was really brilliant and something that wouldn't even have occurred to me to try to do. So I'm interested to see if more people use that kind of technique.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's all sorts of applications for that. Just remembering in the chapter I wrote on when and why, one of the why reasons was, well, assuming you code it correctly, it doesn't make mistakes. Unlike a handmade thing will potentially have errors in it, whereas a procedural system, it will map things properly. But I've never thought of it in the way of manual writing or similar things.
Yeah. I mean, the manual is extremely important to the gameplay of Keep Talking and Nobody Explodes. It's not like a normal manual, right?
Yeah.
In a way, they were generating as much of the game as if they were generating levels, but it was still an impressive leap creatively for me.
But it also means it opens up the possibility for every single time you play, there's a procedurally generated manual.
Yes, that is technically possible. They've locked it off as a dev-only tool, but theoretically that could work.
So you can't just auto-learn the way all the little puzzles in the game work. You've got to actually look at the manual afresh every single time you play.
Yep. And I also thought that Danny Day's chapter on puzzles was really good. I mean, I'm not a puzzle game player or designer, so I mean, maybe it's obvious to everybody else, but the way that he talks about methodically working backwards from a solution that definitely exists and definitely works and can be achieved by the player, and how to really think about the solution space and how forgiving it is and how many kinds of solutions there could be to this puzzle. I really liked that chapter as well.
Must say, I really love all of the narrative focused ones. There's 4 chapters on story, on poetry, on emergent narrative, on characters, and it's such an unexplored area, or at least there's very few good polished products in this area. So reading up on the different techniques and approaches throughout all of that was really fascinating and eye-opening. There's so many different ideas that you could take and run away with and do something really completely new, because it's such an unexplored area.
Yeah, it's still kind of terrifying, the idea of procedural narrative. But I know Ben Cabardis, who wrote the first chapter in that section, at the time he wrote this chapter, he was an employee of Kitfox, but now he's at Concordia University working on, I believe, things related to this, something to do with plot generation and natural language processing. I'm not exactly sure what it all is, but I'm very interested to see what he's working on with procedural generation in the future.
Very interesting. So he turned academic now.
Oh, he was always pretty academic, but he took a brief stint as an indie.
Okay. And then ran away.
He'll be back.
Sure.
We've all been there.
And Kate's chapter on generative art toys. Kate Compton, for those who don't know, she's done quite a lot of very interesting presentations on this area at Proc Jam and the like. And there's just so many interesting, cool examples of these art toys, of these little generative toy things that do all sorts of weird expression things. And yeah, seeing her talk about that, about Twitterbot and so on, was really, really fun.
Yeah, I think we just narrowly missed the window where we could have included a couple of chapters on like machine learning or something and sold an extra few thousand copies.
Yeah, machine learning is very, very hot right now.
Yeah. I don't want to write a book about that, though.
There's a lot of very, very academic books about it already. Not so much on practical usage of it, especially in the game space.
Yeah, not yet. I know there's a Kitfox working on a Pokemon generator. It's pretty interesting, but it's still not a game. But it is an art toy.
I have seen there's the digital adaptation of Terra Mystica, one of the top board games in the world, has some sort of deep learning AI attached to it. and they've released the game, and they've only released an easy AI on it, which is actually quite a challenging AI. And they said that as people play it, they're going to feed this all in, and the deep learning bot will create a medium and a hard AI. And that's very exciting, because we've had deep learning type things applied to chess and Go, but not to the more common board games that we all play.
Yeah, I didn't see that. That's interesting.
So whether it produces anything good or not, I don't know. Currently the AI is pretty good in the game. My own experiences with deep learning is that people are very optimistic about it, shall I say. So it's a little bit like a lot of the early days of procedural generation, when essentially a lot of the stuff was just random rather than procedural.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm also really interested to see how quote unquote deep the learning is for. I don't know if you saw the game Hello Neighbor.
No.
It's a game where it's 3D and you're trying to get into your neighbor's basement because you think something evil is going on down there, but he thwarts you at every turn, kind of thing. And one of the selling points, the marketing points of the game, is that he won't fall for the same thing twice. That he's learning. It's a learning AI, is what they call it. Now they don't use the term deep learning, so maybe they're okay with it being shallow learning. I don't know, but I'm interested to see what happens with that. If it lets gamers, I don't know, be more aware of the limitations and fun parts about procedural AI.
I wonder if that is just logic-based AI rather than deep learning, which is more about chucking a huge amount of data at the AI and let it try and spot patterns and things. I mean, I don't know, but from what you described, if it's just each mistake changes one variable somewhere.
Yeah, I have no idea. I mean, they haven't really released very much information about what they mean when they say it's a learning AI, but given that it's not supposed to be like a massively multiplayer ARG puzzle thing, I assume that means it's not deep learning, unfortunately.
It's still interesting. The whole idea of adaptive AI in general is pretty interesting.
Yeah. But not covered by our book. Ha ha.
And therefore irrelevant.
Yeah.
That was Mark's job. Mark wrote the AI chapter.
That's right.
It was. That is true. That is strictly true. Yes.
Do you want to give a little overview of that chapter, Mark?
Sure. So in the AI chapter, well, goodness, I wrote it a lifetime ago. What did I write? That's a fascinating question, isn't it? I believe I wrote about kind of how certain kinds of AI intersect with certain kinds of PCG systems in a broad sense. I seem to recall I talked quite a bit about NetHack in that chapter, I think, and how some of the more kind of obtuse, high-level ways of playing that game intersect both with the game's AI and with some of the game's PCG systems and the kind of cool effects such as things like polypiling and nurse dancing and so forth that came out of that. And if I didn't write that, I should have written that because it's a really cool topic. I think I also wrote in that chapter a fair bit about looking at how PCG and AI can be combined in ways that haven't been done prior. I think I talked a bit about URR and the dialect system. I think I might have talked about in that chapter, and about trying to get people within the game to all talk in different but still grammatically correct ways based on their culture, and to think about how you can have the kind of underlying aspects of the world shape how all the AI speak based on their culture, their religion, their background, and so forth. And again, if I didn't write that, then I should have written that. But I think I wrote something along those lines in both cases, and I highly recommend the chapter.
Yeah. I remember it being roughly about that as well, and also about giving the AI goals and things like that. And it was all very interesting stuff, especially some of the URR examples. I find there's some interesting crossover between your AI chapter and your meaning chapter.
Yes.
One of the challenges around AI is communicating the meaning behind the AI. And I always have my favorite example of AI in a game and players understanding meaning AI. The first game I ever made, Gruesome, where the AIs all moved randomly, entirely random. But I found some discussion online of players talking about the deep strategies to overcome the AI's tactics. And that made me realize, oh, okay. But similarly, we see games with very advanced AI, and people think, why is this AI behaving so randomly? Why is it so weird? Getting the meaning, being able to communicate that meaning to players, for players to be able to understand and interact with it appropriately. is one of the big challenges in game AI.
Yeah. I think I mentioned the kind of classic case, much like you said with Gru, where in Rogue, I think a lot of the AI would just go towards where the player character is, but then lots of people would kind of read in that they were being flanked, or they were being kind of outthought, or the AI would always turn up at the worst time for the player and things of this sort. And yeah, I'm not sure which chapter I mentioned that example in. I would guess in the AI chapter, but that kind of communicating how the AI thinks without making it completely transparent is quite a cool challenge, I think.
There's also on another level the challenge of if you imagine the whole procedural generation system as an AI, as a dungeon generator for the player,
yes.
Trying to create the right intelligent challenge for the player to go through, and trying to give meaning to how this is all produced. And I've seen some interesting talks before, although never it really done well in reality, of something like Left 4 Dead's AI Director, where it sends waves of enemies to you at the right moments, but done with all the content in the game. So you actually have, a character in the game of an evil dungeon master that is literally communicating to you during the game and changing the environment and changing the enemies and so on, and acting, the game itself being an AI that the player witnesses in that way.
Yeah, I've seen some talk here and there, and I think Mike might have done something of this sort. I think about having PCG systems where the kind of top highest kind of level system has different sort of personalities each time you play, and that kind of concept, and having everything in the game in some way be shaped at least slightly, at least a little bit, based on the kind of fickle choices of the game's PCG system, and trying to make that into something slightly more like an actor rather than just a system is really neat, definitely.
So I wrote a chapter at the start on when and why to use procedural generation. I think, Tanya, you actually came up with that title.
Yeah.
I found it an interesting one to approach, and what was quite interesting to me was actually thinking on the reverse of that for the chapter, when not, and why not, and some of the practical advice to give people, which we don't often hear.
Mm-hmm.
The warnings, you really, really shouldn't use procedural generation for this, or you could do it for this, but it's actually going to take you more time and maybe not necessarily produce something as good as what you want. And when to go all in and when to just hack it. I'm a big fan of the hack it solution myself, but sometimes you want to go all in, and sometimes you need to go all in, and it's no good approaching it with a half-arsed approach. And in fact, we see a lot of games that come out with procedural generation, which is actually more on the random than the procedural side. And probably, this is maybe reading into it too much, but probably because with game budgets and so on, they found that they didn't have the time to make a really, really solid generator. And they probably had the ambition to do so at the start, but practical things got in the way. So it was a very fun chapter to write in terms of thinking of all the negative stuff, but then also being able to counter that with all the really good and interesting reasons to use procedural generation.
Yeah, I feel like everybody talking here now has been thinking about and talking and writing about procedural generation for a few years now, but there's still lots of people that are curious and haven't actually tried it at all. And so I feel like it was kind of the perfect way to introduce it as, well, what is this tool that can sometimes be useful or interesting or fun in game design? And why wouldn't I use it all the time? Or why would I ever use it at all? I think AAA is still kind of struggling with procedural generation as anything other than something to add spice to multiplayer. But I imagine in the next few years, we'll start seeing more and more interesting, bigger budget explorations in that space. And I assume they'll learn a lot of the same lessons that indies have our first few times around, when we spend way too much time on one part of the algorithm, or way under budgeted for how long this part of the algorithm would take, or whatever.
Well, I've never done that, and that's completely alien to me.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I mean, we've seen some examples recently. I mean, I don't know too much about the say the whole Andromeda thing there that was just in the news or whatever, right? Where you have several hundred procedural planets pared down to 7, I think, something like that. And it's one of those things where it's like, do you know what to do with what you're making? I mean, because a game like Starflight, for instance, had 800 procedural planets and managed to put in a plot just fine. And it's just a matter of being able to, I guess, know what you're doing with the stuff that you're generating. I mean, Subversion had a similar problem, right? It's like there was this beautiful city generator, right? You guys have all seen that. The Introversion people made that 3D simulator, but I don't know that the game just didn't come together, right? And it would be the kind of thing that you would make sure that you get your game running first in a more simple environment where you just have like a building generator or something. Make sure the game works, and then you can throw together the city generator. And there's a way of prototyping and thinking about procedural generation so that you don't fall into these problems and don't overscope with it. I mean, I don't know what I'm a poster child for in that regard because the game is not done, but I've been cobbling systems together and remaining afloat, right? So it's a whole new set of skills to learn, and I can see why the AAA people would be, they want to throw procedural generation in the game, but if you don't have experience in that regard, you just end up all over the board. I mean, I think Shadow of Mordor did all right with procedural generation, right? That's kind of what people remember that game for. Even though the maps were all static, people just remember the little orcs with the little names that say funny things and stuff and come back again and again. So there's hope. I think they've had some successful experiments, and we should see some cool stuff, but also some spectacular failures as usual.
Yeah, unfortunately, some of the failures end up being quite well known, and No Man's Sky is the one that really jumps out to me as a game that it's got some fantastic procedural content in there, but when it was released, it didn't have a lot of actual game mechanics to really explore that in a fun and engaging way. And it kind of creates a bad name when that game advertises itself as every atom procedural, and then people find it boring. Then it creates a kind of a bad rap for the whole area of game design. So I'm hoping that things like that don't end up overshadowing the whole area of procedural generation.
Yeah, I don't see I don't know. I don't feel people throttling back, but I don't know what's going on in those boardrooms either, I mean, we're all still going to be working on it, harder than ever, more people getting into it. And I think if people understand, I mean, No Man's Sky is really a mixed bag, right? I mean, there are some super cool things about it. And if you, and it's also, I think, very apparent to a lot of people, like from the get-go, and like what could have been done. And I don't know enough about the inside baseball of it myself to know what happened over there. But I don't feel like it's lessened my hope at all in terms of like space games and stuff that could be made. I mean, partly because I've already seen it done well. I mean, people do need to go back and play games like Starflight. It's funny. I mean, I don't think I have nostalgia glasses on. People have done okay sometimes in the past.
I mean, I think whether you're looking at it from a creative perspective or a financial perspective, I mean, No Man's Sky did fantastic. It's really just more of a, marketing expectations, community management kind of wound that was inflicted. So personally, I don't see there being a big backlash necessarily, but I mean, maybe it's good now that the average gamer does have some literacy in being able to see, well, what am I going to expect when someone says that there are a million procedural somethings? Like, what does that mean to me emotionally? Because I think it meant something very different before and after No Man's Sky. And I think the after is much more accurate and much more, much closer to what they should be expecting when they're told there's a million billion planets or every atom is procedural or whatever.
Yeah, I think the marketing thing is spot on, and Michael Cook actually did a great blog piece about this after, saying about how we can't be pretending with procedural generation that we can create all worlds. Technically, we can create many worlds, but procedural generation isn't a magic wand to make games amazing. And we as content designers need to be responsible in how we pitch our games with this.
Yeah, I guess I'm encouraged to think that even if you are irresponsible, it won't really work for very long. So probably the best long game is just to do the right thing anyway, which makes it easier.
Well, the book's only been out a few days. Hasn't had any reviews on Amazon yet. I guess not many people have read the whole thing yet. But hopefully some people listening will go out and buy it and leave some nice reviews online. 5-star reviews on Amazon are always very well received.
Yes, please. And if you have any ideas of topics that people want for the next, the sequel or spin-off or, I don't know.
The spin-off. I like it. The spin-off series.
Yeah, I guarantee you, Tarn and I will probably see your review. So go ahead and be honest, and we'll take your opinion under advisement.
But still leave a 5-star review.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be interesting to see follow-up works of a similar style, especially involving many authors and getting so many diverse perspectives in, whilst also having the curation that you two both added to it.
Yeah, I really hope people enjoy it.
Yeah, agreed. I'm really looking forward to when it turns up here and being able to read everyone else's chapter in the final version, at least.
Great. So, any closing thoughts?
Thanks, Darren.
Well, I guess my closing thoughts are, I think it's great that a book like this exists now, which is on PCG and games, but not with a focus completely and entirely on code and on systems, as there are lots of books, a few collections of academic papers on these kinds of topics, but they tend to be not so much design focused and far more CS/HCI focused. So as far as I know, as we said at the start of this, this is pretty much the first volume ever of the kind of volume it is, and I think it's great that this exists now.
It's probably worth noting that a sort of book like you described actually came out very recently, Procedural Content Generation in Games, by Julian Togelius and Noor Shaker, and Mark Nelson as well. And that is lots of methods, lots of different, code focus, really great book, lots of fantastic content in it. But like you say, it's got a different purpose than this book. And I think this book is really good for having, it goes on into the low level in areas, but it also has very practical stuff on this is when and why you should use it. These are some different approaches you can look up, and, references to other areas you can go look up, but also bringing in the higher level stuff around things like meaning and some of the newer ideas around procedural narrative and the more unexplored areas. It's got a really great range that I think anyone who's enthusiastic about this area will enjoy.
Well, I mean, inevitably, things like this do age themselves at some point, but I think part of my goal, at least creatively, was that this book, by being a little bit further away from the code itself, it could focus on slightly more timeless concepts where hopefully even in 10 years from now, people who are starting to get into procedural generation will still find these examples useful, will still find these different topics relevant, because they're just all around useful procedural generation in game design topics. Whereas I think if it's, a primer to procedural in Twine or how to use procedural JavaScripts or something like that, it would be much more of a 2016 kind of branded product.
Yeah.
Tarn, any last thoughts from yourself?
Oh, not any in particular. I think it's a great book. That's my 5-star review. People, I mean, it's really it was a pleasure to kind of have the drafts come in and read them. Some of them needed a little more work than others, but we had a lot of people that were kind of professional writers in their own right that wrote chapters that we didn't need to touch up at all. just give a few suggestions here and there, And I learned a lot reading the book. I mean, I felt like I could have written a bad chapter on a lot of the topics.
Yeah.
Because I've done procedural audio, I've done procedural stories, I've done procedural puzzles, I've done all of those things, but never in a kind of it's nice having people that have really been under the pressure to do a great all-around job, because they've thought about these practical considerations that we're saying are unique to this book. Like, I mean, I haven't had to do, say, procedural. I don't know if audio is the best example, in a setting where I wanted a finished product and had to polish it at the end. And mine was garbage. It was fun, but it was garbage. And so I think you get that sort of heart from every author in the book, that you feel like you're reading something by someone who has grappled with the topic at a sort of I don't want to say artisanal. That's a great word, but there you go. At that sort of level that you're going to broaden your perspective when you read the book, I think.
I mean, I also feel like I would stand by each of these authors as being really great people as well, which makes me feel better about the book as a whole. If you get the chance to meet any and all of the authors at GDC or other events, I mean, 100% you totally should, because they're all really, really nice, kind, smart people that are capital G good. So I hope you feel good about your purchase.
I wonder if at some GDC in future, maybe get everyone in the room together. Would that be possible?
Whoa!
Would that just be too cool?
Mind blown. Well, I'm moving to North America, so that makes it slightly easier.
Woo! Where are you moving?
I'm moving to Edmonton in Canada.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Why are you leaving us, Mark?
I was saying maybe we'll see you at GDC more often then.
Hopefully. I will probably submit something for next year, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah, you could always just show up anyway.
Well, exactly. This is true.
So you don't need to get into the buildings and so forth, because people just hang out on the grass. You can just sit in the grass and talk to people for 5 days.
Oh, I was just going to say, I host a procedural lunch for the last couple of years with Jason Grinblatt from Caves of Cud, and maybe next year it should be just the book authors.
I like it. Elite, selective. I like it.
Well, it'd end up being about half the same people, I think.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, usually the problem with these lunches is that you want to invite about 300 people, and you can only fit about 20 in the room, so then it's kind of random what happens. But we're getting off topic.
Right, so that is all about procedural generation in game design. You can get the book direct from the publishers, CRC Press, or from Amazon. We'll give you the links below. It starts off at a cheap $115 for the hardback. The paperback is significantly more affordable if you prefer that, but the hardback is lovely. It would look very nice on your shelf. Is there an ebook?
Yeah, coming in the next few weeks, I hear.
Okay, and there's an ebook going to be coming in the next few weeks. Would you recommend the ebook? There's like diagrams and different things in the book. I wonder if it's the sort of thing that's much nicer as a physical book.
I always prefer physical books, but different people have different tastes. So I assume it will be cheaper than the hardback.
I suppose, yes. All right. Well, that's it. Thank you very much, Tanya and Short, for arranging this. Thank you, Mark, for writing your 3 chapters too. And thanks all for joining the show.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks.
And leave a 5-star review on Amazon. Goodbye.
The show has collapsed. Would you like your podcasts identified?
We'll cut this all out of the recording.